Okay, pop culture class, for those of you that were missing some of the information given in class due to an absence or simply uh, mentally not there, here are the background information that you need for radio from the 20s to the 50s. Obviously, we won't talk much about radio post 1950s because the dawn of television is going to happen in that decade. So if we take a look here at this first slide, you have radio to thank for lots of things. Televisions, airplanes flying in the air without running into each other, cordless phones, wireless internet, GPS, garage door openers, baby monitors, and probably most important to all of us, our cell phones or smartphones are communicating using radio waves. And so those are important things in our lives. Okay, so radio as we think of it, just listening to voices and music over the airwaves, is born in the 1800s is when the technology actually exists, but we don't have the first voice heard over radio waves until about 1900. How it works is something you should probably take a physics class to learn in detail, but the bare basics is that radio waves are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so these are waves that obviously our eyes cannot see, but are yet floating around in the atmosphere around us. And so each wave is going to have its own different frequency. And so information can be transmitted by converting data into changes in either the wave's amplitude or frequency. And that is actually how we get different stations. And there are so many waves out there, you need a receiver that is going to pick up the waves for you. And so the majority of us don't need to worry about what's known as a transmitter, because that is what is converting the data and pushing it out over the radio waves. Most of us deal with receivers, and that those are the ones that are picking up the specific changes in amplitude or frequency and are translating that data back to information that we want to hear. And so when we talk about AM and FM radio channels, we're actually talking about whether or not we are discussing changes in the wave's amplitude, AM, or its frequency, FM. And so AM were the original radio stations, obviously still around today. They're lower on the spectrum than our FM. FM is not as popular in the early days as AM is, because AM would actually broadcast further out, so you could get to a larger audience using AM. But unfortunately, AM is more prone to interference or static. So FM can be a clearer channel, but you don't get as far as a range. So most of us in our cars have receivers, radio receivers, that pick up both AM and FM channels. Of course, your cell phone is both a transmitter and a receiver. And so that's, the basics of how it works. Again, a physics class would cover that in more detail. Initially, radio is born as simply one big giant commercial. And so manufacturers of radio receivers would get together with stores and they would play music in shops and advertise products while you walked around. And so you can see the picture there is actually the transmitter room of radio station KPO, which was located in a Halle's department store, and that picture is from around 1925. And so, as you were shopping, hey, don't forget to check out these products located in the, women's fashion aisle. Those sorts of things you would hear interspersed with music as you shopped. But then as the technology advanced and companies wanted to sell radios, they had to have stations for people to listen to. The good analogy is like the early days of HD TVs. Super cool technology, but if there weren't any high definition channels being broadcast, there was really no point in owning one. And so radio was kind of the same way. And so in the 1920s, you see this explosion of radio stations forming. Radio stations are known by their call letters. Their call letters are just their identification. And those are established by the FCC, which is a government agency, the Federal Communications Commission, and they are going to assign a radio license. And when you apply for a license, you are given call letters that become your ID, and you are told which amplitude or frequency that you are allowed to broadcast over. In the 1920s, we have a conference that determines how we are going to label radio stations. And so in the United States, at this international conference, we are given the first letters K, W, N, and AA through AL. Now, we probably most of us are not familiar with any N or AA through AL radio stations, and that's because those are reserved for the government. The delegates that we sent to this international conference in the 20s were actually military men, and so N is reserved for station identification regarding Navy radio channels, and AA through AL are for the Army. And so public or commercial radio stations get letters K and W as the beginning of their call letters. Originally, call letters used to be just 3 letters, and nowadays it's because so many people were applying for license, they're usually known by 4. WJW, which is now a TV station out of Cleveland. It was one of the earlier license granted by the FCC, and that's why they still just have 3 letters. But then the more that people wanted them, the more letters we added. As a general rule, K is for any radio station or TV station nowadays that is west of the Mississippi River, and W is for any that are right of the Mississippi River. So West Coast has K, East Coast has W, and the only exception would be anybody that was granted a license prior to that being established as protocol. And so an example is the very first commercial radio station in 1920 is KDKA, which is out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It actually still exists today. But that's one of the only K's you'll see on the eastern part of our country. The rest of them are going to be W's on this part of the nation. From 22 to 1923, you're going to see the birth of network radio. And what we mean by network radio is that large groups of companies are going to get together, and they are going to buy up as many licenses as they can, and then they're going to put the same shows and the same commercials over all of those channels across the country. And that becomes big in the 20s. And then we are going to officially label the 20s to the early 1950s as the golden age of radio, simply because it becomes the primary source of entertainment and news for the majority of Americans. Okay, so that's your small introduction. Let's take a look at the major networks that existed, and most of them getting their start here in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The original network is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, which starts in 1926. FDR's Fireside Chats were broadcast over NBC, and NBC was actually started by 3 appliance companies, RCA, Westinghouse, and General Electric. And so they were making radios, and they wanted actual radio stations to exist so that people would buy this new technology. So if they're making empowering radios, you can't have that technology out there without anything to do with it. And so they become the first and one of the biggest still today, as they transferred over to the world of TV, which we'll learn about later. The next one to come around is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, which becomes a network in 1929. They began solely as a way to advertise. Columbia is actually was originally the Columbia Phonograph Company, and so Columbia Records, actually a version of it still exists today. And so Columbia Records wanted to start a network that, you guessed it, would play only artists who were signed and had records with their record company. And so, of course, you'd hear all these awesome songs, and then they'd advertise, hey, go to the store and buy this person's record on Columbia Records label. The next one to come around in 1934 is NBS, the Mutual Broadcasting System. Of the big ones, it's the only one still not around today as a result of bad business decisions in that members of the Mutual Broadcasting System decided it wasn't worth it to get involved with that newfangled technology known as television. Ooh. Failed business choice there. And so MBS ceases to exist as a company as a result. One that is around even today that got its start in the early 40s was the Armed Forces Radio Service. And you'll see in parentheses I have the letter T because it becomes the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service. And so actually a lot of the old radio shows that we will listen to in class were preserved on record, on vinyl, because the Armed Forces Radio Service was recording and copying vinyl and then mailing that vinyl overseas so that people that were involved in fighting World War II could hear their favorite radio shows and new songs from America while they were fighting in the war. And so without the Armed Forces Radio Service, we wouldn't have a lot of these old classic radio shows and commercials saved for future generations to listen to. And then the newest one to come around was ABC in 1943, the American Broadcasting Company, which actually was born out of the NBC company. NBC had two divisions. There was NBC Red and NBC Blue, and they were starting to come under fire from the government for having a monopoly over radio airwaves. And so NBC Blue was actually sold to the guy that owned Lifesavers. So he was a millionaire as a result of his family starting the Lifesavers company. And so he actually took NBC Blue and made it into the American Broadcasting Company for $8 million in 1943, which that was a lot of money back then. And of course, nowadays we know that ABC is owned by the mouse, Mickey Mouse, that is. The Disney company is the parent company now of ABC, at least for a little while longer. It's Disney's least money-making endeavor, so there's a lot of talk about whether or not Disney will actually sell ABC at some point in the near future. And so that's your overview, but before you sign off here, let's take a listen to some of the different call station identification for the various stations. So here's NBC. The chimes still used today. Those three notes are actually GEC. Many people speculate as a result of General Electric Company being one of the starting companies for NBC. CBS Radio. There's your CBS one.
This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
That's NBS. And finally,
this is the ABC Radio Network.
And there's ABC. So those were the ways that the networks would identify themselves, which would be followed by the local stations' four-letter call letter station identification. And so there you have it. There's your overview for the radio networks. Come to class ready to just listen to radio shows this week. Thanks for listening.